The last group that we want to get into before we talk about organisms that are more familiar to you are actually known as the protists. Protists are defined based on how they eat and essentially what they are not. And what I mean by that is these are all protists. They belong to a group known as Protista. Okay. And when we look at them, there are some autotrophs, there are some heterotrophs, and there are some that we call mixotrophy that can both do autotroph and heterotroph mechanisms. So when we look at these, the euglena in particular can switch back and forth between being an autotroph or a heterotroph depending on its environment and what's available to it. That's a great resource, right? Okay, so let me show you a couple of examples and kind of get you into the swing of these protists. They're small. They're not as small as a bacteria, but they are quite small. This is actually a protist from a termite gut that is actually covered in flagella. And you see that. It looks hairy, right? Okay. And looking at it here on a light microscope in this kind of color pattern, and then looking at it on an SEM in this top picture so you can see the surface structures and see just how hairy it is. It's a weird beast, right? Okay, so what's going on with these protists? They're absolutely everywhere, all right? We think that all the things that we're going to talk about from now on, plants, animals, and fungus, all arise from a particular type of protist. Now, we've talked about plants before, looked at them as far as being evolved from green algae. This is a group of protists. We can look at many of these green algae falling into this group. Animals, probably from a group known as cyanoflagellates, and then fungus, probably from a group known as chytrids. And so when we look at those types of organisms giving rise to great diversity in our tree of life, protists are this fundamental common ancestor for all of us. Now, there are three different types of protists that we look at as giving rise to all these groups, but they're all still protists. So we have to look at them with some new structures. In bacteria, we don't talk a lot about organisms moving around. Protists move all over the place. Okay, we also look at protists as being colonial. This is hugely important when we talk about multicellularity. Up to now, we've only talked about single-celled organisms. We have to get into multicellularity here very quickly. There are 100,000 known species of protists, and many of them are actually multicellular, so that helps us with our jump to plants, fungus, and animals. Why do we care about multicellularity? Well, we have to look at the idea that if we have multicellularity, it means that you can essentially multitask, right? Your body is doing many, many things at one time. This is critical for proper use of resources. It allows for higher levels of complexity, and it allows for different growth patterns and availability of new and different characteristics and phenotypes because of this multicellularity. I give you an example here of the giant kelp that actually grows about 180 feet every year. These are huge things, and we look at them as being these very simple organisms that give rise in our tree of life to our three major groups of plants, fungus, and animals that we're going to look at. But we have to keep in mind that on their own, they are fantastically unique organisms that do all kinds of fun things. Now, just like bacteria, they're not all nice. There are some very, very dangerous protists out there, okay? Some you may have heard of before. Giardia. Some of you know this is backpacker's illness associated with contaminated drinking water. Sleeping sickness. This is not just something that affects college kids when they get too tired. Sleeping sickness is a very serious disease caused by a protist. Amoebic dysentery. So looking at essentially having such severe diarrhea that you die from it. The Irish potato famine is actually caused by a protist, or was caused by a protist. There are all kinds of issues with loss of oak trees in California. All of these are resulting from nasty, nasty protists. Now, almost all of these are also waterborne protists, meaning that we're getting them in our systems and exposing other organisms to them from contaminated water supplies. Most of the protists actually will go through some sort of asexual reproduction, just simply splitting, but we do look at some that have evolved sexual reproduction, so particularly the ones that would have led to our higher levels, the fungus, plants, and animals. Now, we don't look at protists as being female and male. Instead, we look at them as being plus minus, okay? Just a different type of structure, but still the same idea. Two different strains coming together to reproduce sexually. With our plant-like protists, when we say they're plant-like, we mean that they're autotrophs. So they can make their own food, all right? There are a couple of different kinds. The most interesting ones actually have led us into multicellularity. So when we look at cyanura, which is associated with high levels of this single-celled structure that actually will form colonies, we start looking into the development of multicellularity. Now, they are still individual cells. This is cyanura on the left. They're still individual cells, but they group together, and within this group, say this top half would actually be associated with getting energy. This side might be associated with waste disposal. This side might be associated with reproduction. So they're still individual cells, but in this group, think about it like a community. You have individuals that are responsible for producing food, individuals that are responsible for collecting waste, individuals that are responsible for organization. They have done this in a very simple way, but it has led to multicellularity because these groupings are much more efficient than organisms that try to live, or individuals that try to live on their own. We start to see transitions to much more complex structures as well in the plant-like protists. Volvox has actually developed reproductive cells, and sea kelp that we mentioned that grow so tall have developed digestive cells. Well, if you're going to be very large, and we said the sea kelp and so on are growing at very, very fast rates, hundreds of feet per year, getting in the energy to do that is critical, right? Okay. So when we look at some of you may have heard the term phytoplankton before. It's the stuff the whales eat, right? Well, phytoplankton are all just single-celled plant-like protists known as algae. Okay? So all of these plant-like protists actually fall into this phytoplankton category. They have very, very high photosynthetic rates. And we look at them as performing much of the Earth's photosynthesis and also supply the base of the food web, because our first heterotrophs that we're going to look at are going to feed solely on these algae. Okay. Animal-like protists, on the other hand, are heterotrophs. So they need to eat something. They're not going to do photosynthesis. So they have to eat our plant-like protists, or they have to eat something, right? So we have to look at how these organisms come to be. Well, we look at them as doing something known as endocytosis. So endo is in, cyto is cell. So this is taking something into the cell. They're eating, right? That's all they're doing, okay? So they're going to take in this food in whatever form it can be. It's certainly not a cheeseburger, right? But they'll eat a lot of bacteria, and so on, that would be important for getting energy in and having a carbon source. The other thing that we look at that's interesting with these guys is they move around a lot. They have something known as pseudopodia. We've mentioned this before, this idea of false feet, and it helps them move around. Giardia is one of the more nasty protists that we look at, and we look at it as being this extremely debilitating kind of protist. And we mentioned it a minute ago with the idea that protists are not all nice. Giardia actually causes high rates of diarrhea, okay, and other intestinal disorders. And we look at the potential for debilitating and possible death associated with this illness, particularly in the elderly, the immune compromised, and the very young. So we worry about these kinds of things infecting our water supplies. So our last group of protists is actually the fungus-like protists. Why fungus-like? Well, fungus are still technically heterotrophs. So they have to eat things. They don't photosynthesize, but they eat things in a very weird way, okay? So when we look at these kinds of protists, they're actually doing what we call external digestion. And I have here for you that they release digestive enzymes. So what they're going to do is release these enzymes onto a food supply, wait for those enzymes to work externally, and then reabsorb the nutrients that have been broken down, okay? So it's bizarre, yes, but it works really well for an organism that doesn't have very complex internal structures. So this plasmodial slime mold, one of my favorites, actually moves by a process known as cytoplasmic streaming, and essentially what it's doing is throwing up digestive enzymes all over everything, absorbing what it can, and then moves along. So it's a fascinating structure as far as its ability to digest and break down things in the environment, particularly waste and so on. The cellular slime mold is actually falls into this same fungus-like protist category, but what it looks at is it can be a fairly mundane, basic structure until its food runs low. And then when its food runs low, it'll actually group into these slime-looking things, blobs, up to 100,000 cells, individual cells coming together, and will actually migrate to find food. Let me show you here. This is a cellular slime mold slug, okay, that's in search of new food. This is hundreds of thousands of cells, potentially tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of cells on the move to find food, okay. Some of you may have seen this before if you had a fish die on the left hand side here, where the water mold has actually attached to the fish. The little filaments that you see coming out are the reproductive structures of the mold itself, the cellular mold, and sending out all of its spores to continue to reproduce.